today I will be giving the global perspective on small-scale fisheries as best as I can in 45 minutes, covering issues like definitions, management, the poverty that pervades many aspects of the sector, and the international frameworks. So let's start at the beginning, which is a good place to start. What are small-scale fisheries? Now, perhaps in your country, you know what small-scale fisheries are. It's pretty obvious to you. But globally, the sector is very diverse. So we get everything from, for example, this woman here who is fishing on foot. That's what we call it. She's collecting something, also considered small-scale fishing. We have, of course, the sort of small canoe fishers, and these are probably the types of fishers we generally think of when we think of small-scale. And then on the other end of the spectrum, we have these very big fleets, which can still be considered small-scale because they meet some of the characteristics of small-scale fishing, but in fact are extensive and can very much dominate the fishery sector in their countries, something like those Ghanaian canoe fisheries that Francis mentioned yesterday. And when we get to this sort of level of small-scale commercial fishing, sometimes the line between small-scale fishing and industrial fishing can become a little bit more blurred. Small-scale fishers are also given different names around the world. So they can be called artisanal fishers, usually referring to small-scale fisheries that are a bit more commercial. Subsistence fishing, of course, when you know, fishing mainly for your own food and your family. We have these terms like indigenous and traditional fishers, often more applicable to developed countries. And we have this all-encompassing term of small scale, but ultimately, at the international level at least, there's no universal definition of small-scale fishers, and this can make it quite difficult to, at least in the international legal sphere, create instruments dealing with the sector at the international level. However, what we do see in small-scale fishers is a lot of common characteristics. So, for example, most small-scale fishers will target nearshore coastal resources. Of course, we can see in some places them going further and further out to chase stocks when stocks deplete. But yeah, traditionally they will, of course, stay close to shore. And traditionally the fisheries will be mixed. So again, this is just common characteristics, not applicable to all small-scale fishers. You know, if there's a particularly high-value resource, they may be primarily targeting that. But most of the time, the fish catch will be mixed. It'll be, you know, a whole lot of different fish that are being caught every day. They also may have traditional fishing grounds that, you know, the community's been fishing in for generations. That can be a bit of a problem when we try and put in, for example, marine protected areas that cover those fishing grounds and potentially cut off access to the fish. So that is often an issue that we face when trying to implement these types of management measures. Often community-based, but also we do see a lot of migrant fishers who follow the fish from place to place, often across the borders of other countries, into the waters of other countries, and then of course we have a problem. There may be many different landing sites. Often they're non-designated landing sites. You can just, a lot of the time, just landing on a beach somewhere. So again, that can make it very difficult to manage the sector, right? To collect data on the sector, to have them report their catch. The resources targeted, not always, but a lot of the time are, you know, not these high-value resources like, you know, the tuna stocks or, you know, offshore fisheries that often will bring in a lot more money. And because of that, if the resources are limited, then these stocks may not necessarily be assessed, which unfortunately, as I discussed yesterday, may bring them under the sort of broad moniker of illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing because of the unregulated aspect, because the stocks are not necessarily regulated. There's also very little tracking of activities. I'm sure for most of you, your small-scale fishers are not, don't have VMS or AIS trackers. often what we see is small-scale fishers don't even have basic navigation equipment, so certainly they're not going to have trackers, which again makes it difficult to manage them. And then one thing which we do see a lot is that many small-scale fishers will diversify their livelihoods. So, you know, fishing, of course, is a risky trade, as we know, from many different perspectives. From the perspective that fish stocks might deplete, from the perspective of the safety issues. And so a lot of the time, what we see in the small-scale fishers is that if available, they will diversify risk by diversifying livelihoods. So maybe engage in some small-scale farming or seasonal construction work, or, you know, work on, you know, large industrial vessels for a certain time of the year. So we do see this a lot in the small-scale sector. Now, if we look at the global perspective on small-scale fishers and the data that we have, which, you know, is a bit lacking, but the data that we have shows that even though, the small-scale sector is not contributing that much generally in terms of value of catch, they do contribute a significant percent of global fish catch. So 40% there of global fisheries catch. If we look at this regionally, we could see in Oceania, it's been estimated that they contribute 31% of the catch. This is significantly more, of course, in regions like Asia and Africa, sort of on par with the Americas and much higher than Europe. From a social perspective, we also see that small-scale fishers make a significant contribution. So, for example, 90% of the people employed along capture fisheries value chains are in the small-scale sector. So they make a massive contribution to employment. There's also 45 million women working in the sector globally, so providing livelihoods for women. And 500 million people globally depend at least partially on small-scale fishers for their livelihoods. So you can see that as a significant number of people that are relying on this sector. However, one of the big problems that we have with small-scale fisheries, managing them and understanding them, is that reliable data is often lacking. So part of this is, you know, some of the reasons we already discussed, the fact that they are not necessarily reporting catch or, you know, landing in designated landing areas, things like that. But part of it is also the informality of the sector, because because of that informality, the contributions of small-scale fishers to things like employment, poverty alleviation, livelihoods, and nutrition are often hidden or they're underestimated. As I said, there's also poor management sometimes of the stocks that small-scale fishers are targeting, which again leads to a lack of formal regulation, and particularly data on women is very low. So there's not a lot of collection of what we call gender disaggregated data. When we collect data on the small-scale fisheries, that is, split between men and women. So we can see the women's contributions as well as the men's contributions. Now, that data I showed you in the last slide, those statistics, came from this report called the Illuminating Hidden Harvest Report, which was released in 2023. And this was a sort of global level attempt to understand the small-scale sector better, collect data on the small-scale sector. But there were also very interesting findings in this report regarding the lack of data. So, for example, even though this was the most comprehensive study to date on the small-scale sector globally, there were still limitations in data availability, particularly for small-scale fisheries in inland waters. We also see that, as I said, there was a lack of systematic collection of reliable and comprehensive catch data, which again undermined the understanding of the contribution of the sector to development. And something very interesting that they found was that within national administrations, firstly, there wasn't enough multidisciplinary expertise in the fisheries department, and the fisheries department was not talking to the other departments which might have the data that they needed. such as the health ministry, such as, you know, bureaus of statistics, there wasn't any collaboration there. And so because of that, you know, the fisheries ministry didn't necessarily have this sort of demographic data which was necessary to help them manage the sector correctly. So, I mean, this is really, you know, a good indication of why you need to have national cooperation, particularly if you want to manage your small-scale fisheries correctly. As I said, gender disaggregated data is particularly lacking, and there was a study done by Harper and her colleagues several years ago, not unfortunately looking at the Pacific, but they did look at several developing countries, Mexico, Peru, Senegal, South Africa, and Vietnam. And what they found was that the collection of gender disaggregated data was extremely limited, and even where they had it, it lacked detail. So the problem with this, of course, is that we can't necessarily provide for gender equality, put in policies to help women if we don't know what they're doing. And so it's extremely important to collect this data, particularly because women's contributions in the fishery sector, in the small-scale sector, often go sort of unnoticed because they might be contributing to the household, for example, doing very informal work which is just not necessarily apparent. They're not necessarily working on the fishing boats, for example. A lot of women work in the pre-harvest sector and the post-harvest sector. So that was kind of the sort of global overview of small-scale fisheries, the data. But now I want to move on to a very important issue in small-scale fisheries that is discussed a lot, and that is the issue of poverty in small-scale fisheries. And I'm afraid this is where the presentation becomes interactive, because I want to know from you what you think about poverty in small-scale fisheries. Do you think that small-scale fisheries are poor? Not necessarily absolute poverty, but maybe relative to the rest of society, or not? And there's no right or wrong answer to this question. We do see great diversity in this globally, but I would like to know what you have to say about it. So are there any volunteers? Anyone want to have a go? Yep. Sorry.
Thank you, Doctor. The word poverty strikes a different feeling for me personally. I don't think small-scale fishers in the Pacific are poor or in poverty. The resources are abundant in our region. I think they are vulnerable to be in a state of lower income or so, but I believe they are not poor, if that makes any sense. You know what I mean, my fellow brothers and sisters? I'm just saying that maybe there are factors that will risk them into maybe the middlemen that come and, you know, and take from them, or maybe when there are other factors of their households come into play. Because in the Pacific we have certain values and things happening in homes that require more money, and so we tend to sell our fish cheaper so that we can get that money in to do other things. But we are not really, I wouldn't term it as poverty. I would maybe say we are a very vulnerable group in the fisheries sector would be the small-scale fisheries. Firstly, another big thing would be it's not really a subsidized sector in the Pacific. It's not really the most looked at industry by the government. So maybe that's where the help is needed to alleviate themselves from being identified as poor or... So yeah, it's just, I don't think they're poor in that sense. There are certain things economically that makes them vulnerable to become poor. Thank you.
Yeah, really excellent. I think you preempted some of my points later on, but yeah, really excellent answer. Does anyone have anything else to add? Do you all agree with that? Does anyone have a different opinion? Yeah, Francisco.
I'm sitting.
Mhm.
So I'm
sitting today as a participant, and I think she has a point. How do you define it?
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, that is what I was saying in the beginning. It doesn't have to necessarily be absolute. It can be maybe relative to the rest of society. We see that a lot in developed countries, that there is poverty in the small scale sector, but you know, it's not absolute poverty. It's relative to the rest of the country.
Coming from a different field, I've faced in education. An example, a person from Tonga who got a scholarship came to USB and had his first lecture, and he was told that he was poor, and he did not realize that he was poor. According to whose definition? And is it the you don't have a sofa at home? No, we don't usually sit on sofas, but it depends on whose definition of poverty, because we value in the Pacific different things. If you can place food on the table, you're rich. And so that would be the why you may have discrepancy with the definition. And is it from a Western point of view, or is it from our Pacific point of view that we view poverty differently?
Yeah, thank you for that really excellent point. And you know, there's a lot of discussion, of course, in the international sphere as well about definitions of poverty. Is it about income? Is it about multidimensional factors? You know, like you say, whether you have a house, whether you have a roof, whether you know you can send your children to school, and so on. So yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's a whole another debate. But yeah, I think for the purposes of this, I'm just trying to understand. You know, how the small-scale fisheries in your societies are faring. You know, whether you think that they are, you know, relatively prosperous, if they're doing well, or you know, if you think that they are suffering, I suppose. So I suppose that's more of the distinction. But thank you so much for all your answers. Does anyone else want to contribute?
Yes. When you put it in that context, I totally agree with the colleagues that are here. In terms of, I think what the small fishes need is the support. Whether there's enough support provided by the state or the government to help them, you know, to be able to sell their produce, you know, in order to sustain their living. You know, it's just those support mechanisms that are available for these small scale fishes to be able to earn a living. I think that's very important.
Absolutely, very important point. So I think, you know, we've kind of come to a bit of a consensus that we don't think small-scale fishers are necessarily poor in this region, but that they may be vulnerable to poverty. And if they are vulnerable to poverty, what are the factors, do you think, that make them vulnerable? Or vulnerable to falling into a state of poverty? I think, you know, Lorian mentioned some of them, but does anyone have anything else they want to add to that? What sort of factors, yeah, make fishers vulnerable?
This new trend that has been talked about, and how fishes go out into the reefs, get fish, or sell it, and then buy less nutritious alternatives. So they sell fish, get some income, and then buy, say, canned tuna or canned fish with noodles, and that's what they bring home. But in there, there's this perception that noodles and things bought from the shop is priced compared to just ordinary fresh fish. It's and today sometimes when you see gathering, children will go for things that have noodles and things, and often stay away from nicely cooked fish.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point. Yep, Raphael. You can have my mic.
Yeah, I just want to have some clarification from Daniel. You said that fishers need support. So my question would be, what type of support do they need? This would be the first question. And a second question more for everybody. Do the small-scale fishers are properly registered, and do they have access to social security in your countries, respective countries? Because at one point, poverty is something, but access to the minimum support, healthcare, and so on is extremely important. Do they have this access? How and why they don't have it? Can you just elaborate on this? First, probably Daniel, and maybe if some other people can elaborate on this aspect of social security. Thank you.
Yes, thank you for that. Yes, I believe, I mean, looking at the labor market, small-scale fishers are those in the informal sector. So most of those workers or people in the informal sector are poorly covered in terms of enforcement of labor laws or anything in terms of support, whether it's social security systems, whether it's superannuation. So mostly these small-scale fishers fall within the category of informal workers, and this is where there's vulnerability in terms of how to ensure that they are well protected under any law for that matter, and the support that they need. So I believe for Fiji, that's why I'm saying it's a challenge not only for Fiji, but throughout globally. The informal sector is not well protected and covered, in terms of social support and mechanisms that are provided by government for that matter. Thank you.
Great. Yep. Very, very important to note the informality of the sector can increase vulnerability. Anyone else have anything to add, or? Yeah.
Just addition to the discussion, I think from Tonga, most of our small-scale fishers, they lack the capacity to operate their fisheries more as a business or a family business for themselves. But then most of their catch, they sell, they spend all of it at one day. And it's not only the small-scale fishers, but it's also happening at some of our commercial fisheries, like our deep water snapper. I remember we conducted a business training for our snapper fishing vessels, and that was run by our Bank of the South Pacific. They assisted us in training these fishers, this license holder, to be able to run their fisheries more as a business. So when they get what they sell from their catch, they can be able to manage their financial income more wisely.
Yep. Excellent. So almost promoting alternative livelihoods in a way to add value to the fish. Yep. Charlie?
Just am reminded on the role of middlemen that was mentioned earlier. In Fiji, I think according to the regulations, a license is given to a person, and if the person has a boat, the license and the boat. Some of the fishers don't have the capacity to own boats, so some of the businessmen, we call them middlemen, they own lots of boats, and they give this on hire to fishers. The arrangement is questionable because some of them drive around in the boat, and that's all they get from the thing. Because the full agreeing in the rent in the partnership goes to the owner of the boat, because the moment they fail to honor the terms of the arrangement, the boat gets taken back to fishes without any boat.
Yeah, very, very important point as well regarding lack of assets and lack of access to credit. Okay, one more comment and then I have to move on.
It's one more question, sorry for you. I would like to know if you have some subsidies for small-scale fisheries, and what type of subsidies, if you have, meaning are subsidies for, we were talking, for example, of labor support, or are subsidies more related to the exploitation of the vessel, like fuel or anything else? Do you have anything for small-scale fisheries or nothing?
This may be development assistance, but the government gives 2/3 if Fijian can provide 1/3 of the cost. So if fiberglass is the subject of the deal, paying the person who owns the thing pays 1/3, and government, and most of the fishes that I know in rural areas have acquired boats under that arrangement.
Thank you. I was just sitting here trying to gather my thoughts on the question in front, and I think it varies. There are those who work 9 to 5 and they also, there are those who work 9 to 5 and there are those who are like, they are highly dependent on resources, marine resources. So just to try to answer that question in front, it varies. And I think one of the factors that make small-scale fishers vulnerable to poverty would be the cost of living. It keeps increasing. And to answer Rafael's question, there are some subsidies that we offer to local fishers. For example, we have the outboard motor project where we give fishers, sell to fishers outboard motors at a discounted price. We also do that for the trailers. That's for them to access more richer fishing grounds. We also have the FAD program where we try to give, where we try to like increase the production of fish coming into the country, and we're looking at other avenues as well, like SBC is helping us with trying to add eco sounders on our buoys, like our FADs, so it's easier for them to like check if there's fish underneath the FADs today, so they can go out and fish.
Great, thanks. That's very interesting. We're going to discuss subsidies more tomorrow, so I'd like to actually pick up on those subsidies tomorrow, because yeah, that's very interesting that you are giving quite extensive subsidies to small-scale fisheries in some instances in the Pacific. Okay, so great, lots of good answers. I think a lot of the global vulnerabilities that we see are then reflected in this region. So these are some of the sources of vulnerability that we do see on the global scale. These include things like the dangers of fishing. Of course, that's a big vulnerability. You can get injured, you can die. That leaves, of course, your family potentially without a source of income. If you're injured, you may not be able to fish. So the dangers of fishing, can definitely be a massive source of vulnerability. And of course, the issue of poor labor conditions on board, particularly if, small-scale fishers are working on larger vessels, for example. A lot of the time what we also see in these vessels is a lack of safety equipment, a lack of communication devices, a lack of navigation aids, all very problematic, massively increases the risk of fishing. Something mentioned by Daniel, I believe, was the informal work, the informal nature of the sector. And because the sector is informal, a lot of the time, fishers are not going to have access to things like social security or insurance through the government or through their employers. The other thing we often see is geographical isolation. Maybe I'm not so sure about the Pacific, but you know, if fishers are living in remote locations, islands, or rural areas, they may also lack access to adequate healthcare, education, finance. That was a big thing that came up as well. The fact that, you know, because fishers are small-scale fishers are both informal and potentially isolated. There is a lack of access to secure finance, which means that they often have to take out these very high interest loans from middlemen, from, you know, local loan sharks, which, you know, of course have very high interest rates and put them into debt bondage. Also a lack of access to justice sometimes, and again, a lack of access to alternative livelihoods. As I mentioned in the beginning, of course, fishers will often diversify their livelihoods where they can, but if there's no source of alternative livelihood, then of course it's impossible for them to diversify their risk. Another big problem is the lack of tenure rights over resources and land. So often fishers will not have secure rights over the stocks that they fish, but also maybe they will not have secure rights over the land that they live on. This, of course, can be a big problem, you know, because coastal land is so valuable. So if a developer wants to come in and put a hotel there, and the small-scale fishers are then cut off from the resources on which they depend, that again is a source of vulnerability. Of course, the issue of climate change and extreme weather events is a massive source of vulnerability, depletion of resources as well. And then on the other hand, we also have, what we see a lot is marginalization of small-scale fishers for various reasons. And this is either marginalization from the society, political and social isolation, or sometimes what we see is marginalization within communities because they do have very hierarchical power structures where those at the top may be sort of elder councils of men, and those who, you know, are more marginalized in the community include youth and women. There we go. So if we think of this relationship between poverty, vulnerability, and marginalization in small-scale fisheries, what we do see a lot of the time is that in order to either prevent poverty or reduce poverty where that already exists, we first need to address sources of vulnerability and marginalization. So a good example is a poverty prevention mechanism. Sorry. Doing the wrong one. Well, a poverty prevention mechanism that we see used is providing fishing rights to communities. And so that at least gives them, you know, some sort of a security over the resources on which they depend. But as I said earlier, if they don't, for example, have secure land tenure, they can be cut off from those resources. So that poverty prevention mechanism is not necessarily going to work in the long run. Similarly, if we don't try to improve equality or reduce marginalization within a community, if you give rights to a community, those rights may just be co-opted, you know, in a process we call elite capture, by the more powerful in the community, and those who are not more powerful, those who are already vulnerable, may become even more vulnerable because now they don't have access to those resources and they have no way of getting them. So just important when we think about poverty in small-scale fisheries that we also need to make sure that we address vulnerability and marginalization. Now, there's a few, not very many, but a few international agreements that have, you know, started to pick up on these issues, started to try and provide holistic approaches to the small-scale sector globally. One of them is SDG 14B, which provides that small-scale fishers should have access to marine resources and markets. And then the big one is the voluntary guidelines on small-scale fisheries, which were released in 2015, or adopted in 2015, I should say. This is soft law, this is a voluntary instrument, but it does take a human rights-based approach to the small-scale sector, considering poverty and socioeconomic concerns. And its core thematic areas are some of these issues that we've been discussing, such as tenure and resource management, social development, employment and decent work, value chains, so it's looking at the whole value chain, including the pre-harvest sector and the post-harvest sector, where a lot of women are working, gender equality, and also, of course, disaster risk and climate change. So this is an important instrument when it comes to looking at the small-scale fishery sector holistically and really taking an approach which considers not only issues of management, but also social issues and development issues. Having said that, we can't, of course, get away from the fact that we do need to find ways to manage the small-scale sector effectively, because, you know, there are problematic practices in that sector as well, and if we consider that they are contributing 40% of global fish catch, it's certainly not a small issue that we have to deal with. But, as Francis mentioned earlier, we have to manage the small-scale sector very, very differently to the industrial sector because of all these issues that we've been talking about today and the differences and the vulnerabilities in the sector. So the big question is, do small-scale fishers engage in IUU fishing? And of course the answer is yes. I mean, all fishers to some extent do engage in this. Not all, a lot of fishers, I should say. So these can, IUU practices in the small-scale sector can include things like incursions into the waters of other countries, particularly, if you have migrant fishers following the fish. Violating protected areas, particularly, for example, when those are declared over traditional fishing grounds without consulting the community. Using illegal gear, this is a big issue in the small-scale sector in certain places. For example, in a lot of African countries, they use mosquito nets to fish, sometimes because they don't have anything different, sometimes just because, the catch is depleting and this is the only way to catch them. Also, there's the issue of light fishing, which happens a lot. And, of course, at the most extreme end of the spectrum, we have things like dynamite fishing, cyanide fishing, and things like that. And then also underreporting or underreporting, mostly because the mechanisms to report effectively often don't exist, or it's difficult for small-scale fishers to report effectively. And then, of course, we have that unregulated problem I was talking about earlier. However, this is often a social justice problem, and that's because small-scale fishers are often the victims of IUU fishing. If you remember what we talked about yesterday about one of the drivers of IUU fishing being food and livelihood insecurity, we can see that oftentimes negative coping behaviors in the small-scale sector are driven by rampant overfishing and IUU fishing in, for example, the industrial fleets, which of course leads to stock depletion, which leads to food and livelihood insecurity. And as I mentioned, the drivers of these activities are very different to the industrial fleets in most cases, and because of that, alternative management approaches need to be considered. So just to quickly go over some of the drivers of IUU and overfishing in the small-scale sector, when we look at the illegal fishing drivers, as I mentioned yesterday, things like food security and food insecurity and livelihood insecurity, I should say, high interest loans and debts, this issue of perceived unfairness, if management measures are, adopted without consulting fishing communities, and also the issue of insufficient resources for compliance. So, if you put in some sort of law or regulation regarding gear, but, the fishers can't necessarily afford to upgrade their gear, this can, of course, lead to non-compliance unless the government steps in and assists. Drivers of unreported fishing, this mainly, of course, relates to just the difficulty of reporting, not having mechanisms for reporting. And when it comes to unregulated fishing, again, as I said yesterday, this is something which is not necessarily the fault of the fishers. This is something the government needs to step in and regulate the sector. And one of the issues here is that traditional management systems, where the fishes, are self-regulating and perhaps managing the stocks quite well, are often not recognized as, proper management of the sector. And so the fishes tend to fall under the moniker of unregulated fishing. And this can cause a lot of issues, particularly because when we start to criminalize IUU fishing, criminalize the practice of IUU fishing, what often happens is small-scale fishers are the ones targeted for reform because they're very easy to see, they're right there, and it's sort of an easy win if you're going to target the small-scale sector, much easier than sometimes targeting the industrial sector. So finally, I know my time is up. I just wanted to go through a couple of management approaches that are sometimes used for the sector. Some, I think, are better than others, or more effective than others. So the precautionary approach is often used because, if you have stocks that are unassessed, you have to, of course, take a more precautionary approach to management. The problem with this, of course, is that if you take a precautionary approach, you are reducing the amount of fish that can be caught, which again can cause some insecurity. Things like dataless management are sometimes used, so we don't have stock assessments. So we just have, we know certain characteristics about the stocks. So we have closed spawning seasons, for example, net size regulations to prevent the catching of juveniles. Obviously, this isn't the sort of best practice when it comes to management, but it is a way that the small scale sector is often managed. We have inshore exclusion zones, which of course are areas set aside specifically for small scale fishers. This can work pretty well in some cases, but of course, if you do have the industrial fisheries going and overfishing the waters just outside of those zones, then it will affect what's coming into those zones. So, it doesn't necessarily work unless you have good management throughout your waters. It's also very important, and this is sometimes used to utilize traditional knowledge alongside scientific knowledge. It can be a supplement to scientific knowledge, just to get a better idea of the state of the stocks. We also need to, of course, recognize and, if possible, provide alternative livelihoods for small-scale fishers to help them diversify their risk. And that is also done in some places. And then the sort of best way, I think, to manage small-scale fishers, and the way that is becoming more and more popular throughout the world, is the use of co-management arrangements. So these arrangements can span anything from sort of just consulting with the fishers to actually devolving responsibility over management of the stocks to the fishers. And so fishers are given a lot of agency in the management of the stocks, which should, in theory, reduce IUU fishing. The important thing to remember with this type of management approach is that this needs to be structured very carefully. There needs to be a certain amount of capacity building for the fishers to ensure that they are able to manage those stocks correctly. What was mentioned as well, things like financial literacy can be very important to ensure that the sale of the stocks is fishers are getting sort of the best prices and being able to access the markets for their stocks. And then finally, sort of an interesting approach that has been trialed in some places is to move away from this sort of command and control, punishment-driven narrative and provide incentives for compliance. So, for example, providing sort of social protection for fishers, some sort of social protection payments, provided that they report. So, essentially incentivizing compliance in reporting. And in that way, both improving the management of stocks, but also improving social and developmental outcomes for small-scale fishers. So these are some of the management approaches that have been adopted. So yes, so that was sort of a quick global overview of small-scale fishers. And I don't think we have time for questions right now, but I'm happy to take any questions afterwards or continue the conversation. But thank you very much.